going on. If the synthesis is too much compared to the exiting, then it's going to make too much fluid, and we're going to have a situation there. Or if those openings between the brain and the outside of the brain are clogged or blocked for some reason, the cerebral spinal fluid is going to continuously be made, and again, it's going to make those ventricles bigger with a lot more cerebral spinal fluid. You can see where we're going with this, okay? So again, there's our Starship Enterprise, the two lateral ventricles over here. Whoop. Lateral ventricles over here. There's the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle is here, and then you have the cerebral aqueduct that's going to connect the third and fourth ventricles. Okay? The lining of this is choroid plexus that makes the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? This was, I don't know why it didn't work, but this is supposed to be the video I just showed you. And you can see it in 3-dimensional. Okay? So, doing a sagittal cut of the brain, all right, there's the brain stem, there's our cerebellum, this is our cerebrum. Right here is the lateral ventricle. Okay? Over here is our fourth ventricle. All right, it's a sagittal cut, so you can't see all the parts of the spinal, all the parts of the ventricle, because it's going right through the midline of the sagittal plate. All right? So I'm not going to ask you about the circulation and the trajectory of the circulation. That's too detailed for us to do in a course like this. But it's going to, it's trying to show you that there is little breaks to allow the fluid to go outside of the brain and bathe the brain and also bathe the spinal cord. Eventually this fluid is going to go through the venous sinuses to eventually get into the bloodstream. And then it gets added to the bloodstream, but then, you know, your body will sense too much blood pressure, and then you'll pee out a lot of the fluid, okay, or whatever adjustments need to happen, okay? But you got to have the amount that's being made has to equal the amount that's exiting. Otherwise, you're going to have a disproportion, and things are going to get compromised, okay? So again, I'm not going to ask you about the parts, but this is a better picture just showing you where the breaks are in the circulation. But you should have an idea that, you know, what a circulation's all about. The, you know, it has to equal, okay? And this is in, if you see the animation, what's happening over here is this, it's showing how the cerebral spinal fluid is pulsating within the ventricles, being made and stuff, okay? So what happens if you have a blockage of this fluid going from inside the brain to the outside of the brain? Or you have cancer of, let's say, the epidermal cells, and it's producing too much cerebral spinal fluid. Either or, you're going to put more fluid in the ventricles. This is a condition we call hydrocephaly, or hydrocephalus, okay? So you have either made too much cerebral spinal fluid, or the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid is somehow blocked, okay? You can imagine that the fluid inside the brain is going to get more and more, and you're going to have intracranial pressure building up. So the ventricles will start distending, and if it's in a newborn, remember the skull bones are not fused together. They have those fontanelles. So as the brain is getting bigger, because the ventricles are getting bigger, so is the head. It's a different symptom if this should happen in an adult. Someone has cancer in, let's say, a 45-year-old with epidermal cells, your brain, the skull is not going to get bigger. They're going to develop a little bit more of headaches at that point. So what's going to happen here, the brain compression occurs because this ventricles get bigger and bigger and gets compressed, whatever skull is pushing it down. So the tissue of the brain is squished. And that can lead to mental retardation and other symptoms when you're dealing with, like, the cerebrum. Some people call this water on the brain. I disagree with that because, if anything, it's water in the brain that's happening. Does that make sense? All right, laymen call it this. We as medical professionals call it hydrocephaly, okay? So this is what happens. The head of a newborn is enlarged. this is what, if you take a cut of the skull here, normally it should look like this. And you can see the ventricles in this way. And there's the brain tissue all here. In hydrocephaly, the ventricles are enormous. As this gets bigger and bigger, I mean, there is some skull there that's going to eventually press down on it. Notice the thickness of the cerebrum, the nervous tissue. It's thinner and thinner. That's going to compromise the way that the person or the child's going to be. Okay? Again, you can see this is a sagittal cut. See how big the ventricles are compared to seeing the Starship Enterprise. Here's a coronal, a transverse cut again, and you can see how big this is. Okay, making the tissue, the nervous tissue, smaller, thinner. All right, and this is how they look. Now, if you look at the eyes, you can look at the eyes, and we call this a sundown effect, the sundown eyes, or sunset eyes. If you look at it, it looks like a sunset, literally, right? The sunset's going on here. The reason why it's doing that is because the brain is so big, it's pressing down on the eyeballs and pushing it down, causing this sundown or sunset effect. Okay? So how do you fix something like this? Well, you got to find out what the source is. What's causing that? And that's a whole brigade of different things that the doctor or nurse practitioner, whoever is going to figure out what's going on. But in the meantime, they could create a shunt to put that extra fluid, extra cerebral spinal fluid, going someplace. We could put a shunt, which is a tube that goes down from around the brain, or in the brain itself, in the ventricles, and they put the end of the tube in the peritoneal cavity. The peritoneal cavity is going to make similar fluid anyway, so it's just going to be added to that. No big thing, because then it gets absorbed, and that's where it gets into your bloodstream and you can pee it out. Okay? Or you could have a shunt that goes from the ventricles itself right down into the heart. And the heart will pick up that extra fluid, and your body will adjust to the extra blood pressure by having the kidneys pee out the extra amount. So this is treatment one. It's called the ventriculoperitoneal shunt, meaning it goes from the ventricles to the peritoneal cavity. Or you could have a ventriculoatrial shunt. You'll learn about the chambers of the heart, and two of them are called the atria. The other two are called, as confusing as it could be, they're called ventricles. Okay, but it goes into the atria. That's why I call it the ventriculoatrial shunt. I'm not going to ask you about these shunts. That's just an FYI, because students like to ask questions like, well, can that be fixed or no? So I eventually put up a couple pictures on here. You should have an idea about hydrocephaly, how that could be caused, but I'm not going to ask you about the shunts themselves. Okay? Questions about that? All right. So let's talk about these meninges, the coverings around the brain and the coverings around the spinal cord. Okay? So it's coverings around the central nervous system. And we have three coverings. Okay? Going from outer to inner. All right, the meninges are composed of these three inner layers, or these three layers. The dura mater, which is the outer layer, and it literally means tough mother. You can't pull it apart. You're going to have to cut through it. And when we dissect brains, we'll be able to see this dura mater. We then have the next layer going in called the arachnoid. And if you know anything about arachnophobia, that is the fear of spiders, okay? So we call this the arachnoid. And it is web-like. When you look at the area, it is web-like, at least the diagrams. This is really too thin to actually see on a dissected brain or any of the models that we have. But the thing is, it's a web-like area. And then the thinnest area is the one that's right attached on the brain itself. It's called the pia mater, which means thin mother, okay? And that's right on the brain itself. Now we have areas that are spaces in between these areas, and they kind of make sense when you go through it. Above the dura mater, we call it the epidural space. We'll talk about that in a moment. Below that is the subdural space. That makes sense, okay? Underneath the arachnoid area, we call it a subarachnoid space. And in the subarachnoid space, This is where the cerebral spinal fluid is flowing around the brain, the subarachnoid space. So it's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Okay? So what does this look like? All right, going from the skull to the brain, you have the outer dura mater. There's the arachnoid layer, and you can see the spider webs, these little strings that are coming down and stuff. Then we have the pia mater around the brain. You can also appreciate the gray matter surrounding the white matter of the brain. Okay? The subarachnoid space is just underneath underneath the arachnoid area. That's where the cerebral spinal fluid lives. Okay? But it's not going to sit there long because it has to circulate. It goes, into the venous sinuses. All right, another picture showing the same thing, but it's now a coronal cut, and you can see the different layers over here. Okay, so you can do that. You can see, just keep in mind, I've been showing you pictures of the brain, but it's also the coverings around the spinal cord also. All right, and that's what's trying to show you on there too. Okay. Now, dealing with hematomas. Hema meaning blood, oma meaning mass or collection of. So this is collection of blood, a bruise, so to say. Okay. We could have two types. We could have an epidural hematoma, and that's going to be found, as the name implies, above the dura mater. This has got to be a strong strike to someone's head, a strong blow to someone's head, where enough force cracks the skull. And as it cracks the skull, usually one of the arteries is also going to get involved. And arteries have a very high blood pressure. Veins don't. All right? Not that you want to do this, but if you cut an artery, the blood is going to shoot out because of the blood pressure in the artery. If you cut a vein, it'll trickle down. It'll bleed, but it'll trickle down because the blood pressure is very low. So an epidural hematoma, this will form a collection of blood quite rapidly, okay? And it causes a fast bleed, and usually, like I said, a fracture of the bone actually occurs, like the temple bone usually gets fractured. Then you have a subdural hematoma. A subdural hematoma, as the name implies, is going to be a collection of blood under the dura mater, but above the arachnoid, okay? In this case, it's usually the bridging veins that get cut, okay? If these are your veins, these fingers are your veins, and you have, let's say, your skull over here, what happens here is that when someone tumbles or falls, not a hard whack on the head, if someone falls down and hits their head, what happens is the skull is going to go forward, and it's going, the skull's going to go forward, and it's going to cut through those bridging veins. Does that make sense? And then you have these bridging veins that are going to have a slow bleed that happens. So you get this compression of the brain gradually that will cause an unconscious moment. We usually see people who fall a lot, alcoholics, the elderly, a blunt trauma, you trip and hit your head on a couch or something like that, like the armrest of a couch. Something like that will happen. Now these are the ones, this one they usually go unconscious right away and stay like that until they could actually evacuate this. This, they may go unconscious for a brief moment, like a few seconds, a minute or something like that, but then they get awake and like, oh, it seems like you're okay. But keep in mind, these are veins that are severed. So gradually, the blood is going to come out and come out and come out, and in about 6 to 8 hours, they can go into another unconscious state. Because now the blood is accumulating so much, it's going to gradually press on the brain and compromise the midbrain that's going to control the area of consciousness. All right? So that's what I want to say. That's why a lot of times the elderly, alcoholics, they want to keep the patient there at the hospital overnight for observation to see if this is what's happening or not, if it's such a slow leak. Okay? Questions about that? All right. So this is showing you the hematoma. The blue here is the dormata, but they're showing two types of hematomas. This is going to be the epidural hematoma. This is the subdural hematoma. Now, let me ask you this. How can you tell by an x-ray if this is a subdural hematoma versus an epidural hematoma? And let me just give you a clue. You can't see the dormata on an x-ray. It's too thin to see. So how can you tell if that's a epidural or a subdural hematoma by an x-ray? What are you looking at? Not so much. And you, let's say, and it's in an area where you can't see the fractured skull, if there is one there. Look at the brain tissue. Devin?
It'd be like just the amount that is pushed down, kind of, like we caught early, the subdural tends to be a lot smaller, and like German is kind of like more of a...
Well, if you see it a few hours later, I'm adding things, I'm sorry. If you see it a few hours later, it's going to look equal.
Shape of the brain?
Not the shape of the vein, no. Dan? Yes, that's what I want you to see. Okay? Notice that, because that's the one with I've been trying to look for x-rays to show this really well, but it's kind of difficult to find them on, believe it or not, on the internet. But here, look at this. This is not going into the sulci, because the dormata is blocking that blood from going in there. But if it happens underneath the dormata, it will go into the sulci, and you won't see the sulci on the X-ray. Does that make sense? This is for those people, especially going into radiography, to pick up those things. Because if you pick up that and talk to the doctor or nurse practitioner and say, look, I just took the X-ray of this, you might want to see it because it will show signs of a subdural hematoma. And you're like, whoa, I want you to be working for me. I don't want you to be working for the hospital anymore. You know, that kind of thing. Little pearls to move you ahead in life, right? But that's the kind of stuff that you should be looking at over there. And the only way for you to understand that is to understand anatomy, right? So that's what goes on over there. All right? Then you could have meningitis. And meningitis is the inflammation of meninges. Most people think, laymen, think that meningitis is a brain infection. Not necessarily. It can lead to a brain infection, but it really is the coverings that actually get inflamed or infected. So what they usually get is a few signs that are pretty ominous. They usually get a fever. Most people getting bacteria, they usually have some sort of fever because your body has to fight against that, and it works better when you have slightly higher temperatures. You also get nuchal rigidity, meaning a stiff neck. You ask the person to tie their shoe, it's like, it hurts. That's nuchal rigidity. They also have photophobia. All right? Photophobia is if I'm going into the patient's room and the patient says she has a fever, and I go into the room and she's the only one there and the room looks like this. I have an idea of why would the lights be off, because they're usually on when I walk in the room. I said, I'll talk to the patient, why, the lights are off. She says, oh no, don't put the lights on, it hurts my eyes. And then I ask her, well, nice shoes, and she says, oh, and she can't bend her neck down, she's got a fever. If I'm seeing those three things, a nuchal rigidity, photophobia, and a fever, I'm thinking meningitis. Does that make sense? All right? And this is bad, all right? There's two types of meningitis. There's bacterial meningitis and there's viral meningitis. Viral meningitis is usually a benign thing. They're usually at home. It's self-limiting. They just have to have them bed rest. There isn't medications you could do. Viral stuff, there isn't many medications. I mean, there's a few antiviral stuff that'll decrease the frequency of certain things. But it's, once you get a virus, you have it. But your body can fight against it usually. Bacteria, that's the deadly one. All right, we could get rid of it, but if it's already spread and it could spread from the meninges and go right into the brain, this is the one we got to watch out for. This is the one that you hear, if there's a meningitis epidemic at your school, they will close down the school, even if there's one child that has meningitis, because they don't want to play games with this one. Okay, so that's the little tidbits about meningitis, okay? All right, and the last thing I want to do is the blood-brain barrier. Really easy about this. Basically, it allows the things to go back and forth into the brain. But there's a blood-brain barrier that's going to limit what can go in there. For instance, lipid-soluble products will go through the brain, no problem. It's going to allow certain things to get into the brain, that blood-brain barrier. But a lot of things it doesn't. One of the things that allows it to go through is alcohol, nicotine, heroin, aesthetics, which is why you see someone walking like this with alcohol, right? It allows it to go into the brain, okay? Gases can get through there through diffusion also, oxygen and carbon dioxide, okay? Water-soluble stuff can also go through there by way of mediated transport, but amino acids and glucose, because the brain is going to need that. The only thing that the brain can use for energy is glucose. It can't use fructose, can't use galactose, it can only use glucose, okay? We have these circumventricular organs. Basically what's happening here, as I told you about, is that there is a few breaks, openings, in the barrier near the third and fourth ventricles, okay? So blood has direct access to this because there's going to be hormones that the brain is going to make that needs to find the outlet to get into the bloodstream. So you've got to have these little openings there, okay? They're small and there's few, but we have to have a few openings to allow the hormones to get into the bloodstream to go throughout your whole body. It also is an area where it's going to monitor glucose and pH and osmolality. This is where we're also going to find that that enzyme called carbonic anhydrase reaction, or carbonic anhydrase enzyme. Remember that that reaction, CO2 plus H2O yields carbonic acid, but that's an intermediate, and it immediately will turn into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Remember the good old days in chemistry? Well, the enzyme that's going to do that is here, carbonic anhydrase. And if you remember, anything that ends with an ASE is an enzyme. This is what's going to speed up that reaction, okay? And that's going to help to bring in, let's say, it's going to tell the brain that there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the blood, so the brain is then going to say, well, we need to, God bless you, we need to cause yourself to breathe faster to get that carbon dioxide out, okay? So it's going to go to your brain stem to do that. Because we have these little breaks, this is where HIV finds those little breaks and can get into your bloodstream, amongst other viruses. That's how viruses get into your brain, by these little doors, these backstage areas, these backstage doors that they can get into, okay? And the blood CSF barrier at the choroid plexus, epidermal cells join to form these tight barriers there, okay? Now, the main drive for respiration, as I mentioned just now, is an increase of carbon dioxide. That's what's going to cause us to breathe, is an increase of carbon dioxide, okay? It's the most powerful respiratory stimulus for us. Now, a lot of people might think, well, what about a decrease of oxygen? No. In a healthy person, it's an increase of CO2, not a decrease of oxygen. You would think either or, right? But think about it. If you don't have much oxygen in your body, your carbon dioxide is going to build up, and that's going to stimulate the brain. Now, this I'm not going to ask you. You'll learn about it in AMP2, but what happens in people with emphysema? In emphysema, they've got a reverse. In emphysema, or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, people who smoke for years and years, they have emphysema or COPD. What happens with them is that they have problems, no problems getting air into their lungs, but they have problems getting air out of the lungs. They can't squeeze that air out of the lungs. So their carbon dioxide starts building up. But apparently your brain, the people in them, the brain sees it as though, well, since there's a lot of carbon dioxide and you're not getting it in, then we're going to go to our second mechanism and say, all right, if you have a decrease of oxygen, we're going to make you breathe. So in people with emphysema, what actually is a stimulus to make them breathe is a decrease of oxygen, not an increase of carbon dioxide as a healthy person would. So how would you apply this stuff? Okay? Someone has emphysema, and you usually see them, not all of them, but let's say, I'm trying to say this without being wrong with this, but if you go to Walmart, okay, and you see someone with oxygen tanks over there, good chance they probably have some sort of emphysema. Not all the time, but they usually do. They're usually hunched over, they have these pursed lips, okay? It's their way of adapting to the pressure so that their lungs and their tubes that go to the lungs don't collapse on themselves. They create this positive pressure. And they're usually hunched over because they're trying to use their abdominal muscles to squeeze out whatever air they can to get out. They have problems getting air out. So that's why not just the oxygen tank, I'm looking at the whole picture. The reason why I'm mentioning that is they go like this, and they're breathing like that. If, God forbid, you see one of them fall over and their cannula comes out of their nose, the first thing an average person want to do is put the cannula back on their nose so they can breathe the oxygen, and that's a good thing. But then they say, well, maybe they need more oxygen, and they start turning up the oxygen. That's wrong, because their stimulus is low oxygen. So if you're going to turn on the oxygen higher, you're actually going to force them not to breathe. Do you see the difference? Okay? So yes, you see that happening. Be a good citizen. Put the cannula back on. Say everything okay. Have someone call 911 and so forth and be with the person. That's fine. But don't turn up the oxygen. They'll stop talking to you. Okay? All right? But again, you'll learn more about that in A&P2, and if you go on respiratory therapy, that'll be your bread and butter. But I want you to understand, for us, for a healthy person, an increase of CO2 is going to be the stimulus for us to breathe. Okay? All right? So why do we breathe? Basically, it's this reaction here. Carbon dioxide easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. The cerebral spinal fluid, the carbon dioxide reacts with water and releases hydrogen ions by way of the carbonic anhydrase enzyme. Okay? The central chemoreceptors inside the brain is going to have receptors that catch on to these chemicals, which are going to be the hydrogen ions. And that's going to say, whoa, you have a lot of carbon dioxide, it's going to make your brain want to exhale. So you're going to start blowing off all this extra CO2. Okay? So this ventilation will eventually, if you think about it, if you're going to blow off the CO2, this is a good review. If you blow off the CO2, there's less here, there's more here. Does the reaction want to go that way or this way? Let me show you again. Let's go backwards a little bit. In a person where the CO2 is going up, it's going to mix with water. The reaction is going to go this way. You're building up more CO2 in your body. Hold your breath. Carbon dioxide will build up in your body. The reaction is going to go this way, which means what happens to the amount of hydrogen, what's the amount of hydrogen ions? Is it going to go up or down? It'll go up. So now you have a lot of hydrogen ions here compared to this, because this, you're holding your breath for a long time, it's going to build up, build up. So this is going to build up. So now this is going to be higher than this eventually. Now which way does the reaction want to go? That way or that way? That way, right? So now you're going to go this way, and then you're going to be able to blow off all that CO2. Does that make sense? Hold your breath. I guarantee you can't you can't fight it. You're going to eventually gasp for air. Your brain takes over. You can't hold it indefinitely because your brain will stimulate that to breathe. Okay? And that prevents an increase of hydrogen called acidosis, right? This corrects that. So that's the reaction that I kind of just drew up for you over here when this happens over here. Okay? Questions on that?